Welcome to Out of the Blue number 363. I'm going to do some musical ones today, but first I wanted to clear up something that was in the news today. A brand new word, scromiting, which they're calling the scream vomit, and which they are attributing to long-term marijuana use. And there's a very basic piece of misinformation that is starting right now, and so I'm going to set it straight, because I have known about scromiting already. I've never called it scromiting, and I'll tell you why. So scromiting, they're saying, is screaming and vomiting at the same time. And it brings up images of puking like your dinner and screaming. And that's not exactly what it is. What it is you're vomiting kind of an emotional feeling, right? So it is like vomiting, but there's no stuff coming out of your mouth. So it's like a scream vomit. It's like you have some emotion trying to come out, and it can just come out like involuntarily, like vomiting. So it is like vomiting. So to call it scromit or scromiting is perfectly accurate. But I, as someone who's more aware than the history even of scromiting than most people, I feel like I have to set the record straight right from today, and say that the vomiting part is actually not stuff. It's like a feeling. It's like some little sick pain from some time ago comes out. And I'll explain it more in a minute, but I just wanted to be clear to begin with that there's no stuff coming out of your mouth other than sound and air. It's sound and air, and it's like an emotion you're vomiting. There's no actual puking. It's not like puking. There's no mess to clean up. See what I'm saying? Okay, so I wanted to just say that to begin with. And it's also funny the way that this news is just taken off and everybody's calling it like puking and screaming. Anyway, when that's not actually happening. It's a scream that is like an emotional puke. All right, so you're with me. Now, as for the history of scromiting, that is something that really is not well known. So I'll do a little minute on that, and then I'll end it, and if you want to stick around, watch the next episode. So the history of scromiting. See, scromiting involves, and they're attributing it to marijuana use. And I'm not going to attribute it to marijuana use because it's not a symptom of marijuana use, but it often coincides. But let me step back a second and describe it first. There's something you hear about today called Tuvan throat singing. And Tuvan throat singing is this way of singing. Let me just try to do it. Stuff like that, right? Now, that's something I learned to do and at the Old Town School of Folk Music. And I've done it elsewhere. But they gave workshops in it, and there's a bunch of us who picked this up. And it's a funny thing to do at parties or whatever, right? But it's actually an art form. And there's a movie called Genghis Blues. If you want to learn more about Tuvan throat singing, watch the movie G.H. Genghis, as in Genghis Khan. Genghis Blues, it's a documentary. And that'll introduce you to the subject. But to get back to scromiting, so I just did that as a physical thing I can do. Scromiting is like that, but it's like a involuntary puke of that, right? So you can be laying in bed at night and you're half asleep, and all of a sudden you're sleeping and it's like, ah! And it just happens. It just wakes you up like that. And it's just like actual vomiting. It's kind of a relief. Like, it doesn't feel bad. It terrifies your neighbors. It terrifies the guy downstairs. But to you yourself, it's like, you finally got that out. And so scromiting is like this involuntary scream vomit. And you're vomiting some little sickness that's in your body somewhere. Maybe a bad memory brings it up, So anyway, and it's not necessarily associated with long-term cannabis use. what it is associated with is kind of coming to terms, like a long-term introspection. Okay, so long-term introspection. So people who are long-time cannabis users are sometimes often long-time introspection. People who've had a lot of long-term introspection, because you smoke up, and you're like, "Ooh, wow, man, remember that time?" So anyway, you get the point, right? So this is a result not of long-term marijuana use, but of long-term introspection. And so, now, as for the history of scrotuming, it sounds like scrotuming, doesn't it? Scromiting, history of scromiting. Scrotuming, maybe we'll edit that out or leave that for someone else to explore. But so as far as the long-term introspection, and puppeteers and theater people and artsy people are kind of sometimes like this. So to be an actor, you have to mine into your own self and find these. Some actors do this. I'm not an actor. I'm not speaking as an actor, but you mine into your own feelings and you come into touch with whatever feeling you're called on to do in the script, right? Well, puppeteers do this too, where they have to manipulate these different personalities, and for it to be real, you kind of get into yourself and you express different sides of your own personality. Okay, and that coincides with the long-term introspection. Through the long-term introspection, you come to these like crumpled up pieces of papers, right? Imagine like your emotional system as a plumbing system, and something's clogging your plumbing, and you dig it out, and it's a piece of paper, crumpled up piece of paper, and you open it up, and it's something written by yourself as a child. It's some childhood memory on this piece of paper. Like, for an example, you got taken away from the carnival. You got carried out of the carnival because it was time to go home. And it was time to go home, and your mother says, "It's time to go home. I don't want to go on the ride." And your dad picks you up and carries you to the car, and you scream and cry. You're 4 years old. That's not abuse, but it's an emotional trauma because you were helpless and you got taken away. And anyway, it's on this piece of paper in your emotional kind of plumbing, and it just gets puked out like really loud. So I'm getting a little off track. To get back on track is the actor / puppeteer. This is the history of scromiting. Sorry, what? Yeah, scromiting. So the history of scromiting is that, and the way I know about it, going back some decades now, is Jim Henson, who was the creator of the Muppets, was an extremely introspective guy, and to create all those things, all those fun characters, he had to kind of mine his own emotional self and get rid of all the junk. And so the scrotuming is like a kind of, is that it? Scrotuming. Anyway, well, this is the beginning of a new subject, but scromiting is a product of this kind of getting really deeply in touch with yourself and cleaning out the pool of your emotions, so to speak. So it's like this pipeline or pool of your emotions has all these little traumas from your past, even small and large, like some very childish things, like I'm saying, getting taken out of the carnival as a kid. And you just get rid of them, and they puke out your mouth with this loud scream, terrifying the neighbors, but feeling good to yourself at the same time. But Jim Henson was a person who knew my grandfather. My grandfather was a puppeteer and a ventriloquist, and was friends with Jim Henson, was older than Jim Henson, was already an established artist when Jim Henson was coming up. And Jim Henson had to kind of get deeply in touch with himself to create all his characters. And so the original Scromit was actually by Kermit the Frog. So the Muppet Kermit the Frog, Jim Henson was working it and just scromited. So Kermit scromited. Whoa! And Jim Henson had to get in touch with this, and so this was something Jim Henson had to work through, because when it's first happening, it just kind of happens to you. It's a uncontrollable barf of "Oh!" Now that wasn't an actual scromit. That was me practicing this tube and throat singing technique. But the actual scromit is a lot like that. It's like waking up screaming, and you don't actually know why. Something. It's like an emotional scream vomit. So, I think I've rambled on long enough. That's the history and introduction to Scromiting and the Muppet Kermit. That was the famous Kermit Scromit. So he didn't. Jim Henson never used this word Scromit, but um, it's now been named. I didn't name it. I didn't make up this word, but Scromiting really becomes, as far as I've already heard about this phenomenon. I didn't really have a name for it, but it's been named now. So the first time it ever happened was the Kermit Scromit, and then different Muppets would Scromit, and Jim Henson got through this Scromiting period, and he was able to develop as an artist. But this was like a step in a process. This is a physiological process that happens within the emotional system of the human being. So that's the history of Scromiting, and see you next time. Thanks.